In this video, we're going to talk about the expansion of the Persian Empire and its interaction with the Greeks and the famous Persian Wars. As Persia expands further and further westward, and you can tell now our timelines have caught up. In week 2, we really sped ahead so I could give you the full picture of what the ancient Mediterranean looks like when it begins to interact with ancient Greece. Now, our history of Greece has caught up to that point in the mid 500s, early 600s BC. And so the Persians have captured Babylon, they've conquered Lydia, they're expanding further and further westwards. And so more and more Greeks are coming into the orbit of the Persian Empire because, of course, the Greeks aren't only living in Greece, as we discussed last week, they've established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. One area where the Persians become the rulers of the Greeks is an area called Ionia. Ionia refers to the very western part of Anatolia. There's that important region again, where the Ionian Greeks had settled at the time of the Dark Age, when they had fled from the Dorian Greeks. However, so the Persians become their rulers, but the Greeks have this spirit of individualism, have this spirit of competition, are never totally content with accepting Persian rule. And so in 499, they appeal to the Greeks on the mainland for help, and they rebel. The rebellion was initially successful, but was not able to go far enough to force the Persians to sue for peace, and relatively few of the Greek cities from the mainland got involved. Only the Athenians had about 20 ships. Now, despite the fact that the rebellion received so little support, it caused a lot of trouble for the Persians, who could not suppress the rebellion for 4 years. And when they did so, they burned the city, they deported the rebels, and this was unusual for the Persians. Remember, the Persians had established a reputation as peaceful and tolerant conquerors. So the fact that they took this very extreme approach to the Greek rebellion shows they recognized the threat that this rebellion posed. And the Greeks in the mainland now feared a Persian attack. In 493, a man named Themistocles was elected as archon in Athens. He recognized the value of the Athenians' traditional familiarity with the sea. The Athenians are familiar with using the sea as merchants. The navy is their key military strength. And a navy and fighting on sea is something the Persians are not familiar with. They're used to fighting on land. You look at their empire, it's dominated by land. And so he and another warrior named Miltiades encouraged the Athenians to resist the Persians. Meanwhile, the new Persian emperor, Darius, remember we talked about him in week 2 as well, used the Athenians' participation in the Ionian revolt as an excuse to attack Athens. The Athenians had supported this revolt that had been so dangerous and taken so long to subdue, and so he demanded that the Athenians submit to Persian authority. Usual Persian deal: submit peacefully, live peacefully. Persians are always going to keep expanding. The Athenians refuse. The Spartans also refuse. Many other Greek cities agree to submit to the Persians. There's this myth that it was sort of all Greeks against all Persians. And especially at the beginning of this conflict, that was not the case at all. But in fact, it was the Athenians and the Spartans alone who resisted the Persians. And so the first Persian attack is launched by Darius. He has about 200 ships, 25,000 soldiers, and he sets sail to attack the Athenians. The Athenians appealed to the Spartans for help, but the Spartans could not come. So the Athenians, with 10,000 troops, waited on the plain of Marathon, looking over the coast where the Persians had landed, just 20 miles from Athens, looking for their moment to attack the Persians. So this is the famous Battle of Marathon. The Athenians choose exactly the right moment to attack the Persians when they're confused, moving their troops off the ship. They attack them in the ideal location in a sea bay that's surrounded by hills, so the Persians can't use their numbers. And over 6,000 Persians are killed, only about 200 Athenians are killed. So this is a huge victory for the Athenians. And the Persians sail away. Hasn't changed the fact that the Persians are still a really powerful empire, but it's shown that the Athenians can resist them. It's shown they can defeat them even when they're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Shortly after the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians discovered a huge silver mine. And there was a movement among some of the more populous politicians to say, hey, we just discovered a ton of silver. We should give a bunch of silver to every Athenian citizen. Share it equally, right? Themistocles, however, convinced the assembly, and he said, we need to use these resources to develop our defenses. And the Persians, we've defeated them once, but they're going to be back. And so he convinced the Athenian assembly to use these resources to build a state-of-the-art Athenian Navy. And state-of-the-art meant this type of ship called a trireme. And so you have 3 banks of rowers who are rowing beneath decks. Everyone's seen the movies about galley slaves. No slaves rowing these ships. Each ship was staffed by 180 rowers. They were well paid by the government. They had to be just like the citizens who built the pyramids of Egypt. They had to be incredibly strong to do the work that they were intended to do. So they couldn't be sort of maltreated slaves. In 1987, a really cool project to create a mock-up trireme. It had a metal ram on the front that weighed 500 pounds. It could go at 11 miles an hour. And so, of course, you have to train the rowers to do all this. And it could turn on its axis, it could turn 180 degrees in a minute. And so this is pretty impressive for a ship this long that's powered by oars. But we think the actual historical ships and their crews were probably much more efficient. It's a bunch of historians and their volunteers trying to work out how to maneuver these ships. People who did this, whose lives depended on doing this well, were probably even more efficient than this. Probably were able to make the ships go faster, make them turn more quickly. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of what these ships were like. Okay, now you're going to want to move on to the next slide. Darius died in 486, and his son Xerxes took over his plan of attacking and conquering the Greeks. And so he prepared a massive bridge from Asia into northern Greece for his massive army. Most of the Greek cities, especially in the north, refused to fight against the Persians. Didn't trust the other Greek cities to defend them. Remember, the Greek cities are all kind of individualistic and competing with one another. And matters looked pretty desperate. And so Xerxes' invasion lands in Greece. He has 250,000 troops. He has 1,200 warships. And the Spartans resist his efforts to advance in the valley of Thermopylae, which you can see from this map is to the north of Greece. And so they're blocking this passage into Greece. And they have about 1,000 men to make this stand. So this is the famous stand at Thermopylae, 300 Spartans, a few other allies, and they fight this heroic stand. And this is the virtue and the strength of the Spartans, that this rigorous training, some might say harsh training, breeds in them the ability to make heroic stands like this. And so they make this heroic stand. Eventually, they are surrounded and killed. But Thermopylae is important because it is inspiring. It was inspiring at the time as it is inspiring now. And it inspires the other Greeks to see some kind of common identity. Even though they're used to just fighting and competing with one another, they recognize there's something that binds them together as Greeks, this desire to resist the Persian Empire, to fight for their independence. And so we start to see greater unity among the Greeks following Thermopylae. But the Persians still hold the upper hand. They capture and burn the city of Athens with almost no resistance. And now it seems as though they're going to be able to finish off the Greeks. One trump card the Greeks have left, expertly wielded by Themistocles, is the Greek Navy. And at the Battle of Salamis, he is able to lure the Persians' larger but less maneuverable fleet into tight quarters and destroy the power of this fleet. The Persians lose over 200 ships, the Athenians lose 40, and Xerxes' expedition is now compromised. And the Greeks are able to follow up on this success with 2 important victories, the Battle of Macaulay and the Battle of Plateau. And in these battles, we see the different Greek cities united together for the first time, or many of them united together for the first time against the Persians. And we see the Greeks assembling their biggest ever armies. And what we're seeing is that Greek weapons and Greek strategy meant they could kind of hold their own with the Persians, even if they faced overwhelming odds. But when the numbers are roughly even, as they are after the Battle of Salamis, Xerxes has lost his navy, he can't reinforce his army. It means that there's no comparison. The Greeks are going to crush them every time. And so this is the story of the Persian War. It is one of the finest hour of Greek civilization, one of the finest hours. This defense of their independence, their individual freedom, that would become such an important ideal of Western civilization, has its origins in this titanic struggle that they fight against the Persian Empire. But it's also important to remember that only certain Greek cities, only certain Greeks participated. So that's just kind of an interesting caveat to remember. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and talk about the Peloponnesian Wars in the last video for this.